You're standing in the grand salon of Chateau de Longueuil on a winter morning in December. The air smells of incense and damp stone. Servants are draping cloths of gold over every surface, but no one is smiling. In the corner, a girl sits perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap so tightly her knuckles have gone white. She's wearing a gown that weighs more than she does, stitched with pearls and embroidered with the fleur-de-lis of France. She is 15 years old. In less than an hour, she will walk down that aisle and marry the man who destroyed her father's army, who seized her cities one by one, who starved her people until they had no choice but to surrender. This is not a wedding. This is the signing of a surrender document in silken ceremony. And the girl in the corner, Anne of Brittany, knows it. Before we go any further, I have to ask, where in the world are you watching this from? It genuinely amazes me that a story this old, this buried, can reach people across continents and centuries, all because we share this strange hunger to understand what people endured before us. Now let's go back. Because to understand how a child queen ended up marrying her executioner, you have to understand what Brittany was and what it meant to lose it. Brittany, in the late 1400s, was not France. It was the last free Celtic nation in Europe, a rugged peninsula where ancient languages still echoed in fishing villages, where dukes ruled with fierce independence, and where the people saw themselves as fundamentally different from the kingdom looming to the east. For centuries, Brittany had resisted absorption. It had its own laws, its own culture, its own identity. And in 1488, when Duke Francis II died, he left behind no sons. Only 2 daughters. The eldest was Anne. She was 12 years old. The moment Francis took his last breath, every major power in Europe turned to look at Brittany like wolves circling wounded prey. King Charles VIII of France, barely older than Anne herself, saw an opportunity to finally swallow the duchy whole. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian saw a strategic alliance that could counter French expansion. And Anne stood in the stone corridors of her father's castle, listening to advisors argue over her future as if she were a piece of property to be appraised and sold. At 13, Anne made a desperate gamble. In a secret ceremony that would later be condemned as treason, she married Maximilian by proxy. The emperor wasn't even there. A stand-in held her hand while she spoke vows in a language she barely understood to a man she'd never met. It was a political Hail Mary-Anne attempt to place Brittany under the protection of the Holy Roman Empire before France could strike. But Anne had underestimated how ruthless teenage kings could be. Charles VIII did not negotiate. He invaded. French armies swept across Brittany in the summer of 1491 with methodical brutality. They didn't just conquer, they strangled. Supply lines were cut. Fortresses fell one after another, and slowly, deliberately, they tightened the noose around Rennes, where Anne had taken refuge. Picture her standing on the battlements, watching the horizon fill with French banners like a plague spreading across the landscape. She was 15. Her proxy husband's promised armies never came. Maximilian, it turned out, had more pressing concerns than a girl he'd never met. The siege lasted months. Inside Rennes, food supplies dwindled. Anne could hear the distant thunder of cannons testing the walls, could smell smoke from burning villages in the countryside. Her advisors spoke in increasingly desperate tones. There was no relief coming, no rescue, no miracle. Just the slow, grinding reality of a war Brittany could not win. And so Anne faced a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Surrender and marry Charles, or watch her people starve. On December 6, 1491, Anne walked into the Cathedral of Longueuil. The ceremony was magnificent. Hundreds of witnesses, mountains of gold, the finest musicians in France. But if you looked closely at Anne's face, you'd see something the official records don't mention. Her eyes were hollow, empty, because she understood exactly what was happening. She wasn't becoming a queen, she was becoming an asset of the French crown, legally bound to the conquest of her homeland, and the marriage contract made this explicit. If Charles died before she did, Anne would be required to marry his successor. She wasn't just marrying a king, she was being written into French law as hereditary property to be passed from one ruler to the next, like a title deed. Their wedding night was conducted with witnesses nearby to confirm consummation. Think about that. Anne's most intimate and traumatic experience being initiated into marriage by the man who had conquered her country was treated as a matter of state record. The blood-stained sheets were displayed as proof. Her violation was evidence. Her trauma was protocol. But something interesting happened in the weeks and months that followed. Anne discovered she was stronger than anyone, including herself, had imagined. She was pregnant within months, and the French court erupted in celebration. An heir to cement the union. A prince to secure Brittany's absorption into France forever. But Anne's feelings were more complex. Hope, yes, that this child might give her leverage, might make her valuable in a new way. But also dread, because carrying the conqueror's child felt like the final betrayal of everything her father had fought to preserve. The baby was stillborn, a fully formed son, born dead in the 6th month. Anne held the tiny body in her arms, this prince who would never rule, this child who had died without ever drawing breath, and she felt the court's attitude toward her shift immediately. She was no longer precious vessel. She was defective merchandise. Courtiers who had bowed and scraped days earlier now whispered behind her back. Was she cursed? Was God punishing the union? Could she even produce healthy children? Charles showed no grief, and that's when Anne understood with devastating clarity she was not a wife who had lost a child. She was a failed breeding project that needed to be recalibrated. What followed was a nightmare that would define the rest of Anne's life. She endured at least 14 documented pregnancies over the next 2 decades. Most ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Those that reached full term often resulted in infants who lived days or weeks before dying. With each loss, Anne had to navigate not just the crushing personal grief, but the political implications. Each dead child was another mark against her, another failure in her primary duty, another reason for enemies to question her value. Imagine the psychological toll. Each pregnancy brought hope she couldn't quite suppress, despite everything she'd learned. Each loss reinforced the lesson that hope was dangerous, that attachment was weakness. Anne developed a kind of protective numbness, a way of experiencing pregnancy without fully believing in it, preparing for loss even as she went through the motions of preparing for life. But here's what makes Anne's story more than just tragedy. She learned to find power in the spaces between catastrophes. While Charles was off playing soldier in Italy, squandering France's wealth on doomed campaigns to claim the throne of Naples, Anne was effectively ruling France. She met with ministers, managed correspondence, made decisions that should have been the king's responsibility. She was discovering that even trapped queens could wield influence if they were strategic enough. And then, in 1498, fate intervened in the most absurd way imaginable. Charles VIII was walking through the galleries of Château d'Amboise when he struck his head on a low stone doorway. He collapsed immediately and died within hours. The king, who had forced Anne into marriage, who had made her endure years of loss and humiliation, was killed by architecture. He was 27 years old and left behind no surviving children. Anne was free for approximately 30 seconds, because the marriage contract was very clear. She now had to marry Charles's successor, Louis XII. But Louis had a problem. He was already married to Joan of France, a pious woman who had been his loyal wife for 20 years. The solution was typically medieval in its cynical efficiency. Louis would obtain an annulment from the Pope, claiming the marriage had never been valid. Anne watched the annulment proceedings with growing horror. Louis claimed Joan was physically deformed and unable to consummate their marriage, a claim that was both false and monstrously cruel. Joan was dragged through public humiliation, forced to undergo examinations, had intimate details of her body debated by church lawyers, all so Louis could discard her and claim an. When Joan was finally cast aside and sent to a convent, and understood she was watching a preview of her own potential fate. Royal women weren't people. They were problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed, assets to be redistributed. But Anne had learned something crucial during her years with Charles. She'd learned that even within systems designed to deny her power, there were tiny spaces where she could negotiate. When Louis came to claim her as his bride, Anne shocked everyone by demanding terms. She would marry him. Yes, the contract required it, but this time she wanted guarantees in writing. Brittany would retain certain autonomous privileges. She would have a say in matters of succession, and most importantly, if Louis died before her, she would not be forced to marry his successor. She would be free to choose her own fate. The negotiations were extraordinary. Anne, now 22, and hardened by a decade of loss and political warfare, faced down the most powerful king in Europe and extracted promises that should have been impossible for a woman in her position to obtain. She was using her own value as a political asset to carve out small zones of autonomy within the prison of royal marriage. The second wedding, in 1499, was nothing like the first. Anne was no longer the terrified teenager trembling at Langia. She entered this marriage as a negotiating partner who had secured unprecedented terms. She was still being forced to marry against her will, yes, but she'd managed to impose her own conditions on the arrangement. It was a small victory, but in the context of Anne's life, small victories were everything. Louis XII proved to be a different kind of husband than Charles had been. Where Charles was brutal and neglectful, Louis was calculating and pragmatic. He understood that Anne wasn't just a wife, but a political partner whose cooperation was essential to effective rule. Their marriage, while still fundamentally coercive, developed into something resembling mutual respect. It was partnership born of necessity rather than affection, but after what Anne had endured with Charles, it felt like mercy. Anne threw herself into her new role with fierce determination. She established a court culture that blended French sophistication with Breton traditions. She became a patron of artists and scholars who celebrated Breton heritage, ensuring that even as her homeland was absorbed politically, its culture would survive. She created networks of female power that operated outside traditional diplomatic channels, corresponding with queens and noblewomen across Europe, sharing information and support. These were acts of subtle rebellion, ways of preserving what she could while accepting what she couldn't change. In 1501, Anne gave birth to a daughter named Claude. The child lived, thrived, became the light of Anne's life for the first time in years, and experienced the joy of successful motherhood. But even this happiness was shadowed by political reality. Claude was a daughter, not the son France desperately needed. Anne's subsequent pregnancies followed the familiar, heartbreaking pattern. Sons who lived only days, daughters who never drew breath, the endless cycle of hope and grief that defined royal motherhood in an age where a woman's worth was measured by the sons she could produce. Each loss was both personal tragedy and state crisis, courtiers whispered. Foreign ambassadors sent coded reports, and Anne felt the weight of an entire kingdom's expectations crushing her with each failed pregnancy. But she'd learned to find purpose beyond childbearing. She established schools and hospitals. She commissioned works celebrating women's achievements. She carefully managed Claude's education, determined that her daughter would be prepared for the realities of royal life while protected from its worst cruelties. By 1513, Anne's health was failing. She was only 36, but she'd lived several lifetimes' worth of trauma. Years of repeated pregnancy, physical strain, and relentless political pressure had taken an irreversible toll. But even as her body weakened, her mind remained sharp. Louis, now 52 and in declining health himself, was already contemplating contingency plans for the succession. Anne knew she was running out of time to secure her daughter's future. Her final political masterstroke was arranging Claude's betrothal to Francis of Angoulême, Louis's heir presumptive. It was brilliant strategy. By ensuring that Claude would marry the next king, Anne was protecting both her daughter's position and Brittany's continued connection to the French throne. If Anne couldn't produce sons herself, she'd at least ensure that her daughter's sons would rule. Anne died on January 9, 1514. She was 36 years old. Her last words were reportedly a prayer for Brittany, a final acknowledgement of the homeland she'd been forced to sacrifice. The funeral was magnificent, befitting a queen who had shaped the destiny of nations. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from the common people of Brittany, who lined the roads as her body made its final journey. They didn't remember her as the queen who had married their conquerors. They remembered her as the daughter who had tried to save them, who had preserved what she could of their identity and culture when everything else was lost. The girl who stood in that tower watching enemy armies approach could never have imagined the life that awaited her, but perhaps she would have recognized the courage it required, the strength needed to keep fighting when victory seemed impossible, to protect what mattered most when everything else was being taken away. Anne's daughter Claude would go on to marry Francis I and become Queen of France, enjoying freedoms her mother had never known. The cycle of forced marriage that had defined Anne's existence was broken by Anne herself. Through years of careful negotiation and strategic planning, standing in the cathedral at Langeais, 15-year-old Anne couldn't have known that she would become one of the most powerful women in European history, even as she remained trapped by the systems that elevated her. She couldn't have known that her losses would number in the dozens children. Homeland, autonomy, dignity, but perhaps she understood, even then, that some battles are won, not through resistance, but through persistence, not through dramatic gestures, but through the quiet, relentless determination to save what can be saved. The wind still blows through the towers of Nantes, carrying salt from the sea and stories from the past. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear the echo of a young girl's voice, defiant and unbroken, promising that some things will endure long after the armies have passed and the conquerors have turned to dust.